Before we go any further, let me ask you something honest. If a man spent 40 years doing everything right, working hard, staying quiet, asking for nothing he hadn't earned, and the world still found a way to put him in the corner, what would you call that? Bad luck, poor choices, or something colder than either of those words? Drop your state and your local time in the comments. And if you stay until the end of this story, I promise you the answer will find you before I do. Elias Ward woke at 4:50 every morning, not because an alarm told him to, because his body had long ago stopped distinguishing between rest and readiness. 40 years of early shifts at the Kellerman Industrial Works on the south side of Detroit had built that clock into his bones, and now even on days when there was no shift to report to, his eyes opened in the dark and his hands were already looking for something to fix. He lay still for exactly one breath. Then he rose. The apartment was small in the honest way of places that have never pretended to be anything else. 2 rooms divided by a narrow hallway, a kitchen where the linoleum had bubbled near the stove and been pressed flat again with a piece of scrap metal, and 3 finishing nails, a window that faced the alley and let in the particular gray light of Detroit mornings, the kind of light that didn't so much arrive as settle like dust after a long disturbance. He dressed without turning on a lamp, dark trousers, a white shirt he had ironed the night before and hung from the closet door so the creases would hold. He moved through the dark the way men move when they have lived long enough in the same space to know every inch of it by memory and by feel, past the small table with its single chair, past the bookshelf with its row of technical manuals and one worn Bible that had belonged to someone else before it belonged to him, past the closed door at the end of the hall. He paused there the way he always did, listened, heard the thin, irregular sound of breathing that had been getting thinner and more irregular for the past 8 months. He pressed his palm flat against the wood of the door, not to push it open, just to know the door was there, just to be close to it for a moment without making her feel watched. Then he went to the kitchen and started the coffee. Her name was Doris Ward. She was 81 years old, and she had been the first person in Elias Ward's life to look at him without calculating something, not his usefulness, not his gratitude, not his ability to eventually disappear and stop being a complication, just him, the boy she had found and then chosen and then refused to let the world take back. She had a bad lung now. The doctors used longer words, but bad lung was what it came down to, the kind of bad that medications managed but did not fix, the kind of bad that turned a fierce, self-sufficient woman into someone who had to accept help in the morning, which she did with the kind of irritated dignity that made Elias understand exactly where he had learned to carry difficulty without advertising it. He counted the pill bottles on the counter while the coffee percolated. 4 bottles, 3 of them were nearly empty. He did the math the way he always did, the quiet, practiced arithmetic of a man who had been making numbers work harder than they wanted to for most of his life. He would need to refill 2 of them before Friday. He had enough to cover 1. He closed his fingers around the bottles one by one and set them back in their row, perfectly straight, as if precision were a form of control and control were a form of hope. This was the life Elias Ward had built. Not glamorous, not the life anyone would have written a story about if the story was only about what was visible on the surface. A man in a small apartment counting pill bottles before dawn, pressing his palm to a closed door to feel the presence of the woman sleeping behind it. A man whose hands were permanently stained at the knuckle lines with the ghost of machine oil, no amount of scrubbing fully removed. A man whose truck had 212,000 miles on it and ran because he understood it well enough to fix every problem before the problem became a failure. But underneath that surface, if you knew where to look, there was something else entirely. There was a wooden box under the bed in the room Elias slept in, not large, about the size of a shoebox, though it was made from a heavier wood, old and darkened with age. Inside that box were a few folded documents, a photograph too faded to read clearly, 3 letters written in a hand that was not his, and one object wrapped in a square of flannel cloth. I did not take the box out that morning. He rarely did, but he knew it was there the way you know about a stone in your shoe, not always actively aware of it, but never fully without awareness either. The object wrapped in flannel was half of a metal badge, circular about the size of a silver dollar, broken along a jagged line that made clear it had once been part of something larger. The metal was heavy and had been worn smooth along the edges by years of being held. On the front you could still make out part of an engraving, 2 letters, a partial outline of what might have been a crest or a seal. The rest was on the other half, wherever that was. I had been wearing it the night Doris found him. That was all she had ever told him about where it came from. He had been wearing it, and then she had kept it safe, and then years later she had given it to him and said, "Only keep this close." He had kept it close for 59 years without knowing why. The coffee finished. He poured a cup, drank it, standing at the window, and watched the alley below come slowly into the gray light of an October morning in Detroit. A cat moved along the fence. A light came on in the window of the building across the way. Somewhere a truck engine turned over twice before catching. Ordinary sounds. The city waking up on a Thursday, except that today was not an ordinary Thursday. Today was the day Elias Ward was going back to Westbrook. He had almost not decided to go, had in fact talked himself out of it 3 separate times over the previous 2 weeks, each time with what felt like perfectly sound reasoning. He had no interest in seeing those people. He had built a life that belonged to him, and it didn't need their witness to make it real. He was 62 years old, and he was well past the age when other people's opinions of him carried any useful weight. All of that was true. But then there was the other thing. Howard Gaines was going to be there. He found out from a former classmate. He still occasionally exchanged messages with a quiet man named Rollo Westcott, who had gone on to become an electrician in Ann Arbor, and who had none of the social ambitions of the people who organized these events. Rollo had sent a brief message, heard they're honoring old Gaines, might be his last one, thought you'd want to know. Howard Gaines. Elias hadn't seen him in over 20 years, but the name landed in his chest the way the names of real things always do, with weight, with warmth, with the particular ache of something that mattered so much that even distance couldn't make it ordinary. Gaines had taught technical engineering and applied mechanics at Westbrook Technical Academy from 1979 until his retirement in 2003. He was not an impressive-looking man, short, slightly round, with glasses that slipped down his nose and a habit of tapping his knuckle against machinery when he was thinking, as though asking it to reveal its problems through vibration. He drove a 10-year-old Buick that made alarming sounds on cold mornings. He brought his lunch in a brown paper bag. I wore the same 4 cardigans on rotation. I was also the only teacher at Westbrook Technical Academy who had ever treated Elias Ward as though his presence there was not a problem to be managed. Westbrook was not officially a school for wealthy students. It was a technical academy, state-funded, theoretically open to anyone who qualified. But funding, in the way of most institutions, had a way of flowing towards certain zip codes and away from others. The students who came from the right neighborhoods arrived with the quiet confidence of people who had grown up in rooms where their intelligence was assumed. The students who came on scholarship from places like the South Side arrived with something else, a particular alertness, a constant low-grade awareness that the ground beneath them was borrowed rather than owned. Elias had been one of those students. He had been good with machines since before he could name what he was doing. He had an instinct for mechanical systems, the way components related to each other, the way failure in one part put stress on another, the way a machine's sound changed slightly before something went wrong, like a voice shifting in register before bad news. Gaines had recognized that instinct in the first week of class and had never once treated it as surprising. I did not say for a boy from your neighborhood. He did not say given your background. He simply looked at Elias's work, recognized what was there, and responded to it directly. He gave him harder problems. He argued with him about engineering solutions with the genuine investment of a man who wanted the best answer rather than deference. When the school's resource library didn't have a reference Elias needed, Gaines ordered it from somewhere else and left it on his desk without comment. When Elias came back from a difficult weekend, the kind of weekends that happened when you were 17 and poor and living in a neighborhood where the odds were structured against you, Gaines did not ask questions. He simply put a more interesting problem on the desk and waited. It was Elias had understood only later, one of the most profound forms of respect one person can offer another the refusal to reduce someone to their circumstances. In an empty classroom during Elias's senior year, after a week when the weight of everything had made it difficult to think clearly, Gaines had said something that Elias had carried for 45 years without ever finding a reason to put it down. He'd said humiliation is not evidence of inferiority. It is only evidence that the humiliated person has threatened something in the people doing the humiliating. Remember that the next time someone tries to make you smaller than you are. Elias had not forgotten. So when Rollo Westcott sent that message, the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than his reasoning. He was going to see Howard Gaines one more time. He was going to thank a man who deserved to be thanked. Whatever else the evening brought, that was the reason he was going. He told Doris over breakfast. She was sitting up against her pillows, the morning light on her face, one hand resting over her blanket, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to conserve energy without appearing to surrender it. She listened to him without interrupting, which was not her usual approach to conversation. When he finished, she said, "Go, if you're going for your own reason, not theirs." He said, "I'm going to see Gaines." She nodded. Then she looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had always seen through his composure to whatever was actually moving underneath it. Then she said, "If they try to make you small, Elias, make sure you're still standing when they're done. People who enjoy doing that, they're always hoping to see someone kneel." The words stayed with him all the way to Westbrook. Westbrook Technical Academy sat on the east side of Detroit in a building that had been renovated twice since Elias had walked its halls, new facade, updated signage, a glass entryway that announced ambition without quite achieving architecture. The grounds had been dressed for the occasion, rented lights strung through the oak trees along the front walk, white fabric draped from the entrance columns, a hired band playing inside the main hall, audible as Elias approached through the parking lot. He had worn his best clothes. That meant the dark trousers he reserved for occasions, a white dress shirt, a jacket he had owned for 12 years and kept in good condition because he understood that things lasted if you treated them properly. His shoes were old but polished, not expensive shoes, but honest shoes that said a man had taken care of what he had. I was aware walking across that parking lot of the cars around him, the German sedans and the American luxury trucks, the vehicles of men who had graduated from Westbrook and gone into engineering management or corporate consulting or the kind of law that made large numbers move quietly between accounts. He was aware of the disparity, the way you become aware of weather, not with resentment exactly, but with a clear-eyed recognition of what the temperature actually was. I walked in without hesitating. The registration table was staffed by two women in their early 50s who had the particular energy of people who had organized this kind of event before and considered their efficiency in doing so a form of social status. One of them looked up when Elias approached, ran her eyes from his shoes to his face in a single practice movement that lasted less than a second, but contained an entire assessment, and then looked down at her list. "Ward," he said, "Elias Ward." She found the name. Something moved across her expression. Small, involuntary, the kind of thing that wouldn't register unless you were watching for it. He was watching for it. She handed him a name badge without comment. He signed the sheet, clipped the badge to his lapel, and walked into the main hall. The event had the architecture of money-performing nostalgia. Round tables with white linens, a bar staffed by young people in black uniforms, the band playing standards from a low stage near the far windows. Everywhere the soft percussion of confident people greeting each other, the handshakes and the laughter and the anecdotes that had been improved by 40 years of retelling. Men in expensive suits, standing in the postures of people who had won whatever competition they'd been running and had arrived here tonight partly to confirm that the winning was mutual and recognized. Elias moved through it carefully. He was looking for Howard Gaines. He found him near the east wall, sitting in a chair that someone had thoughtfully positioned slightly apart from the main flow of traffic. Gaines was smaller than Elias remembered. Age does, that compresses people, seems to remove some structural element that had held them at a certain height. He was using a wooden cane, now one hand resting on the curved handle with the careful dignity of a man who had accepted the necessity of the thing without making peace with it. His hair had gone fully white. His glasses were the same style, slightly too large, slightly too far down his nose. When Elias came close enough, Gaines looked up, and his face did something that Elias would carry for the rest of his life. It lit up, not the performed brightness of social recognition, the real kind, the involuntary illumination of someone seeing a thing they had genuinely hoped to see. "So it's really you," Gaines said. His voice had thinned with age, but the quality in it hadn't changed. That particular directness, that absence of performance. Elias crossed to him. When Gaines reached out his hand, Elias took it, and the grip was still firm, the grip of a man who had spent decades handling machinery and had not entirely lost that in retirement. "I heard you'd be here," Elias said. "A teacher hears many things." Gaines smiled. "Very few of them are useful." That made Elias almost laugh. They talked for a few minutes, apart from the noise and the movement of the room. Gaines asked about the work genuinely, the way he had always asked, not as social filler, but as actual inquiry. Elias told him about the years at Kellerman, about the systems he had maintained, and the younger mechanics he had trained in the years before the plant closed. Gaines asked about Doris. Elias told him about the lung, told it straight, without softening it into something more comfortable. Gaines listened with his whole face, the way he had always listened. "You look well," Gaines said finally. "I'm still standing," Elias said. Gaines nodded, as though that answer mattered more than any resume, any title, any accounting of what a man had accumulated. "Good," he said quietly. "Good." They were still talking when the energy in the room changed. It was a small shift at first, a slight reorientation of bodies, a change in the direction of certain glances. Elias registered it the way he had always registered changes in systems, through accumulated detail rather than a single obvious signal. Then he heard the voice, Elias Ward. He knew the voice before he turned. He had known it for 40 years, since the hallways of this building, since the particular social physics of a room that had never quite decided what to do with him. Conrad Vane. How was a large man, well maintained in the way of men who had spent significant money on the project-tailored suit, silver haircut, clothes, the physical ease of someone who had always occupied the center of whatever room he stood in. He had been that way at 18, and the decades had only refined it, added layers of confirmed expectation to what had once been simple entitlement. There were people around him. There were always people around Conrad Vane. That had been true at 18, and it was true now. He crossed the space between them with the unhurried pace of a man arriving at something he had arranged, and he stopped at a distance that was just slightly closer than courtesy required. "Elias Ward," he said again. His voice carried enough to reach the nearest cluster of people without technically being addressed to them. I was wondering if you'd show up. Elias said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was not the same as retreat. Conrad looked at him the way you look at something you are filing away, from the shoes up, slowly returning to the face with an expression that had been engineered to appear warm while delivering an entirely different message. Still working at Kellerman, he asked. Kellerman closed 3 years ago, Elias said. Right. Conrad tilted his head slightly, as though this were information he was generously receiving. So what are you doing with yourself these days? Working, Elias said. Conrad smiled. The smile reached his eyes in the way of practice things. Good for you, he said. He said it the way some people say, bless your heart, with the surface of a compliment and the structure of a diminishment. The people around him received this with the low, easy laughter of an audience that understood its role. Elias looked at Conrad Vane and felt for a moment the full weight of 40 years, not just the years since graduation, the years before that, the years of borrowed books and secondhand tools, of being technically present in institutions that had never been designed with him in mind, the years of being visible enough to be condescended to, but not visible enough for it to matter to anyone with the power to change it. Conrad Vane had been a particular feature of that landscape, not the worst of it, not by any measure the worst, but consistent, reliably, elegantly consistent. Someone nearby handed Elias a drink, not as an act of hospitality, as a gesture that contained a suggestion about roles, about who served and who received service, about the natural order of a room like this one on a night like this. Elias accepted the glass without responding to the suggestion in it. He was still looking at Conrad. The group expanded slightly as more people drifted in from the surrounding tables. Elias registered this too, the slow, casual assembly of an audience in the way that cruelty always preferred, not a direct confrontation, a gathering, a social arrangement that looked organic and was anything but. Conrad tilted his head and said something to the woman beside him that Elias didn't fully hear, and the group laughed again, the particular laughter of people who understood they were being generous in allowing someone to witness their sophistication. Then an older man, Elias recognized him, could not immediately place the name, raised his glass, and said in a tone calibrated to carry exactly as far as it needed to, "So, what brings you out, Elias? Catching up on how it's done." More laughter, softer this time, but the edge was there. Elias said nothing. Gaines, standing nearby with his cane, had gone very still. Conrad reached to a passing tray and lifted a glass of water, the plain kind, the kind set out near the back tables for the support staff and the caterers. He looked at it with an expression of performed surprise, then looked at Elias, and his eyes carried something specific in them, a memory, a reference point. He said, "You know, I just remembered, senior year, the fundraiser you were collecting cups after." He shook his head slowly as though moved by the nostalgia of it. That kind of work ethic. He paused. It really is something. The group's attention had sharpened. Several phones, Elias noticed, had shifted in ways that were not accidental, and then the thing that had been building became the thing that arrived. A man at the edge of the group, young enough to have graduated a decade after any of this happened, old enough to have absorbed the room's social hierarchy. In the first 20 minutes, reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and held up a folded bill. His face had the bright, unself-aware expression of someone who thought he was joining in rather than crossing a line. "Here you go, Ward," he said, "for the commute home." The room did what rooms do when a line is crossed. It went slightly quieter and then slightly louder, and people looked at each other with the rapid calculations of bystanders deciding whether this was the moment to become witnesses or participants or neither. Elias stood perfectly still. I was aware of the phones, aware of Conrad's expression, which had moved in the span of a second from amusement to something more careful and watchful, aware of Gaines beside him, who had straightened against his cane with the particular tension of a man preparing to say something that might cost him. He was aware of all of it, and inside the stillness something had begun. Not rage, not the hot, immediate kind that broke things and gave people the story they wanted. Something colder, cleaner, the kind of clarity that arrives in men who have spent 62 years learning to observe accurately and remember completely. He looked at the folded bill. He looked at the man holding it. He looked at Conrad Vane. Then Howard Gaines brought his cane down against the floor once sharply. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the room with the authority of a man who had once controlled 30 students with nothing but a change in his expression. "Shame on you," Gaines said. His voice was quieter than the cane's impact, but it traveled farther. He did not shout. He did not perform. He said it the way you say something you know to be simply and absolutely true. Shame on every last one of you. The group fractured slightly, embarrassment, moving through it in small, uneven waves, not strong enough to undo what had been done, but real enough to make some faces look at the floor. Conrad recovered first. He always did. He said something smooth and social about old friends and old memories and the particular warmth of reunions, and several people around him nodded and found the opportunity to drift away, and the moment began its social process of being converted from cruelty into anecdote. And then the sound reached them. It was subtle at first, a change in the quality of noise near the entrance, the particular silence that spreads from a single point and moves outward through a crowd, the way a stone dropped in still water sends rings to the shore. Elias felt it before he heard the car itself, the slight turning of heads near the front windows, the straightening of postures, the way certain faces, the faces of people who understood the language of wealth, changed register. Through the tall windows facing the front courtyard, he could see it. A black car, not flashy, not the aggressive display of new money, something quieter and more certain than that, a vehicle that communicated power through the completeness of its restraint. It moved through the Westbrook entrance at a pace that suggested no particular urgency and no awareness of needing permission. Conrad had turned to look. Several of the gathered group had turned to look. Even the band, Elias noticed, had let a measure pass without full attention. The car moved across the courtyard and did not stop at the sponsor entrance near the main steps, did not stop at the honorary receiving area where the academy's director stood with 2 board members, did not stop near the cluster of men in the most expensive suits who had positioned themselves where arriving wealth would most naturally come to rest. It stopped in front of Elias Ward. The driver stepped out first. White gloves, immaculate uniform, the controlled face of a professional who understood that his composure was part of the service. He walked around the front of the vehicle with measured steps, reached the rear passenger door, and opened it. Then he turned, not to Conrad Vane, whose name appeared on 3 of the sponsor banners visible from where they stood, not to the academy director, who had begun moving toward the vehicle with the hopeful speed of someone anticipating an important donor, not to anyone in the gathered group, which had gone collectively quiet in the way of people who have suddenly lost confidence in the social framework they believed they were operating inside. He turned to Elias Ward. High inclined his head slightly precisely, with the formal respect of a gesture that had been practiced into naturalness, and said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, "Mr. Elias Ward, Mrs. Briggs is waiting for you, sir." The courtyard forgot how to breathe. Elias heard it, the total collapse of ambient sound that follows a moment no one in a crowd has prepared for. The laughter was gone. The music had trailed into silence. The particular social noise of a successful reunion, that steady, confident hum of people performing their own accomplishments for each other, had dropped away as cleanly as a cut wire. He heard Conrad Vane make a sound, not a word, just a sound, the sound of a man watching something arrive that his framework had not included. Elias looked at the open car door. The interior light glowed against dark leather. The night air carried the faint, expensive scent of cedar and something clean he couldn't name. He was aware of the phone still raised around him, still recording, now recording something entirely different than what they had intended. He looked at Howard Gaines. The old man had not moved from where he stood with his cane, but his expression had changed, not to surprise exactly, but to something that looked, if Elias was reading it correctly, like relief, the particular relief of a man who has believed in something for a long time and has just received an unexpected confirmation that the belief was not foolish. Gaines caught his eye, said nothing, gave the smallest nod. Elias straightened his jacket. He was not rushing. He would not give this moment the energy of hurry. He crossed the courtyard at his own pace. Behind him he could hear Conrad beginning to say something, trying to find a tone, a register, a social interpretation of what was happening that would allow the group to reassign meaning to what they had all just witnessed. But the words had no traction. The moment had already moved past the place where reinterpretation was possible. When Elias reached the car, the driver stepped aside without a word. Elias stood for one moment at the open door, 62 years old in his 12-year-old jacket and his polished, honest shoes, with the ghost of machine oil in his knuckle lines and the half of a broken badge in the pocket of his trousers and the full weight of a life built on nothing but effort and refusal. He bent and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with the soft, sealed sound of a world that had just changed. And in the silence of that interior, before anyone spoke, before anything was explained or revealed or demanded, in that suspended moment between what his life had been and what it was about to become, Elias Ward sat with his hands resting on his knees and understood one thing clearly. Whatever was on the other side of this, he had not knelt, not once, not tonight, not in 40 years. The interior of the car was the quietest place Elias Ward had been in years, not silent. There was the low, seamless sound of the engine, the soft compression of tires over asphalt, the faint movement of the city beyond tinted glass. But the quality of the quiet inside was different from the quiet of his apartment before dawn, different from the quiet of the machine floor after closing. This was a constructed quiet, the kind that came from materials chosen specifically to exclude the world. He sat with his hands on his knees and let his eyes adjust. Across from him, in the rear-facing seat, a woman was watching him with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and is now carefully verifying that the thing has arrived. She was in her mid-60s, perhaps slightly older, the kind of age that on certain women resolves into authority rather than diminishment. Her suit was charcoal gray, precisely fitted, worn without any apparent awareness of it, the way people wear things that have long since become part of their standard operating equipment rather than a choice. Her hair was silver, close cut, framing a face that was composed in the specific way of people who have spent decades in rooms where losing composure carried consequences. On her lap sat a leather portfolio closed. One hand rested on top of it. On that hand a single ring plain band, no stone, not decorative, more like a marker. Her eyes were doing something specific that Elias noticed immediately. They were not assessing him the way people had been assessing him all evening, the quick dismissive inventory of a man who didn't fit the expected profile. They were searching, looking for something they had a prior reason to expect might be there. He returned her gaze without speaking. He had learned early that silence in unfamiliar rooms was information gathering, not submission. She let the silence run for another 5 seconds. Then she said, "Put your hand down." He looked at her. "You reached for it when the driver said my name," she said. "The badge. Put it down." Elias looked at his right hand. It had moved to the outside of his jacket pocket, where the flannel-wrapped half-badge sat, without his being consciously aware of making that choice. His fingers were pressed against the fabric from outside. He lowered his hand slowly and placed it back on his knee. She said, "My name is Eleanor Briggs. I've been looking for you for a long time, Mr. Ward." He said people who look for someone for a long time usually have a reason they don't start with. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of a point landed. "That's fair," she said. "Then I'd like you to take the badge out, place it on the seat between us." He considered this for a moment, then he reached into his pocket, unwrapped the flannel carefully, and set the half badge on the leather seat. Eleanor Briggs looked at it, not with the curiosity of someone seeing it for the first time, with the careful, controlled expression of someone seeing confirmation of something they had hoped was true and feared might not be. She exhaled once, a slow breath controlled on the way in and slightly less controlled on the way out. Then she opened the leather portfolio on her lap. She removed a photograph enclosed in a clear protective sleeve and held it out to him. He took it. The image was old, the particular warmth and softness of photographs from the early 1960s before digital sharpness changed what memory looked like. A man stood in what appeared to be a workshop or small factory floor surrounded by early model industrial equipment. He was perhaps 40, lean and straight, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His face held the kind of look that belonged to men who had built things, not pride, exactly, but a settled confidence that came from having made something real with their hands. Beside him, one large hand resting on the child's shoulder, stood a boy, perhaps 3 years old, round-faced, serious, in the way very young children are sometimes serious, with the gravity of people who haven't yet learned that seriousness needs a reason. Around his neck on a simple chain hung something, half of a metal badge, the other half of the badge sitting on the seat between them. Elias's fingers tightened around the photograph. The protective sleeve crackled softly under the pressure. He made himself breathe. He said, "Who is the man?" Eleanor said his name was Thomas Harlow. He founded Harlow Industrial Group in Detroit in 1959. By the time this photograph was taken, the company was worth approximately $40 million. By the time he died in 1978, it was worth considerably more. His brother Douglas took over management of the holdings after his death. Douglas has run the company and the family's associated interests ever since. Elias looked at the child in the photograph, at the badge around the child's neck. He said, "And the boy." Eleanor said Thomas Harlow had one son. His name was given as Thomas Harlow Jr. in the birth records, though the family called him by a middle name. In 1966, when the boy was 3 years old, there was a traffic accident on Interstate 94, west of Detroit. A vehicle carrying the boy and 2 household staff members was struck by a commercial truck. One staff member survived with serious injuries. The other, the boy's mother, died at the scene. Elias went very still. I had not expected that. The information arrived with the specific weight of things that should have been known for a lifetime and were not. His mother, a woman whose face he had never seen, whose name he did not know, who had died on a highway in November 1966 while someone he had not yet met decided that the child she had been protecting should not be found. He sat with that for a moment, a full, complete moment. He did not rush past it. He let it be what it was, the weight of an entire missing history, compressed into a single sentence landing in the body of a 62-year-old man who had never known where he came from. Then he said, "And the boy." Eleanor's voice was careful when she continued, "The boy was not found." The official account described it as a likely abduction, someone taking advantage of the post-accident chaos. There were searches. There was a period of public attention. Thomas Harlow spent a significant amount of money on private investigators over the following years. He never found his son. He died in 1978, believing the boy was either dead or gone beyond reach. She paused. Elias said, "You think I'm the boy?" Eleanor said no. His chest tightened, then released. She said, "I think you are Elias Harlow." The name hit him in the sternum, like something physical, not painful exactly, but substantial, the kind of impact that rearranges rather than breaks. He set the photograph down carefully on the seat beside the badge. He looked out the window. The city was moving past in the particular way it moved at night, the orange wash of streetlights, the dark gaps between buildings, the occasional lit window in an upper floor suggesting ordinary life, continuing inside, while something extraordinary happened out here in the dark of a moving car. He said, "That's not a small thing to tell a man." She said, "No, it isn't." He said, "And you're telling it to me in a car at night after watching me get publicly humiliated at a school reunion." "I wasn't watching the humiliation," she said. "I was watching you." He turned back to her. "There's a difference," she said. "I needed to see how you carried yourself under pressure, whether what I believed about you was confirmed by what I observed." It was. He looked at her for a long moment. The car was moving through streets. He knew the east side transitioning toward the near west, the particular urban patchwork of Detroit at night. He said, "What happens now is my decision, not yours." She said, "Yes, entirely." He said, "I want to go home first." She nodded as though she had expected exactly this. He said, "And Mrs. Briggs, whatever the next step is, I take it because I choose it, not because you've arranged it." "I understand," she said. He looked back out the window. In the glass he could see the faint reflection of his own face. 62 years old, the face of a man who had learned to recognize the difference between an open door and a trap, because in his experience the two things often looked identical from the outside. He reached over and picked up the half badge from the seat, wrapped it back in the flannel, put it in his pocket. Then he was quiet for the rest of the drive. The apartment looked smaller than it had that morning, not because anything had changed about the dimensions of the rooms or the position of the furniture, because he had been somewhere larger and brought the comparison back with him. And now the kitchen with its bubbled linoleum and the window looking out on the alley existed simultaneously as home and as evidence of everything that had been withheld. He sat with that discomfort for a moment in the dark of the hallway. Then he pushed it aside. This was home. It had been home for 40 years. The discomfort of comparison was not a fact about the apartment. It was a fact about the evening and evenings past. The light under Doris's door was on. He knocked once. "Come in," she said. She was sitting up against her pillows in the yellow light of the bedside lamp. Her blanket was folded back to her waist. On the small table beside her sat a half-empty glass of water and one of her prescription bottles, the lid replaced. Her reading glasses were on her nose, though there was nothing in her hands to read. She had been waiting. The particular quality of her waiting, the stillness of it, the careful composure told him something immediately. He had known this woman for 59 years. He understood the difference between Doris at rest and Doris holding something in. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed. They were quiet for a moment. In the alley outside, a door banged. Somewhere a few streets over, a car stereo passed and faded. He reached into his pocket. He unwrapped the flannel. He set the half badge on the bedside table next to the water glass. And then he reached into his jacket's inner pocket, where Eleanor Briggs had placed a copy of the photograph before the car stopped, and he set that down beside the badge. He watched Doris's face. She looked at the badge first. Her expression did not change. Then she looked at the photograph. And for the span of perhaps 1 second, one single unguarded second, she stopped breathing. That was enough. Elias felt the floor tilt beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. He said, "You know what this is?" Doris did not answer immediately. She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she set her reading glasses on the table and folded her hands over the blanket with the deliberate composure of someone choosing how to enter something difficult. "Yes," she said. "I know what it is." He said, "How long?" She said, "Since the night I found you." He sat with that for a moment. "I need you to tell me," he said. "All of it. From the beginning." She looked at him. There was something in her face that he recognized now as something he had never been able to name before, a kind of long exhaustion, the specific tiredness of a person who has been holding a significant weight in a specific position for a very long time. Not guilt, not shame, something more complex than either. The fatigue of a promise that had outlasted the circumstances that made it necessary. She said it was November 1966. You were 3 years old. He didn't move. She said there had been an accident on I-94. People in the neighborhood heard about it on the radio, a bad one out past the Schaefer exit, multiple vehicles. The word went out the way it did back then, through the network of people who paid attention to those things. She paused. There were times when we had nothing that accidents meant salvage, metal, rubber, fabric, whatever the road didn't want anymore. I'm not going to dress it up differently than what it was. He said, I know what it was. She nodded. I drove out there in a neighbor's truck. He lent it sometimes if you gave him a few dollars for the gas. By the time I arrived, most of the official business was done. Police ambulances, 2 tow trucks, already hooking up the damaged vehicles. There were men in suits moving around the edges of things with the manner of people who were in charge of something other than the accident. Private security, I understood later, not police. She reached for the water glass, took a small sip, set it back. The salvage wasn't much. She continued. They had cleared most of it quickly. I was working along the ditch on the south side of the road where some glass and metal had scattered into the grass. Moving east, there were thorn bushes along that stretch, long ones grown into the fence line. She paused. When she continued, her voice had changed by a register, not softer exactly, but more interior, as though she was speaking from a place she had visited many times only in memory. Behind the third set of bushes, she said there was a sound. Elias was absolutely still. Not crying, she said, not calling out, just breathing, small and very careful, like something that had learned in the previous hours that making noise was dangerous. She looked at him directly. I pushed the branches aside, she said, and there you were. The lamp hummed softly on the table between them. In the alley, the wind moved something lightweight across pavement. You looked at me, Doris said, like you had already learned that adults were not automatically safe. Elias looked down at his hands on his knees, the hands of a 62-year-old machinist, the knuckle lines with their permanent ghost of machine oil. He looked at them as though trying to locate inside them the hands of a 3-year-old in a ditch on a November night in 1966. She said you were wearing that badge on a chain around your neck and one small gold stud in your left ear, only one. The other had been torn out at some point. You had mud on your legs and a cut on your temple that had stopped bleeding. Your clothes were expensive, not the expensive of someone who bought expensive things, the expensive of someone who had never thought about the price of things. He said you should have taken me to the police. Yes, she said. He said you knew that then. Yes, she said again. Her voice was steady. I knew it then. A pause. He said so. Why didn't you? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, because before I reached the ditch, I heard something else. He waited. There were 2 men standing beside a black vehicle parked on the service road east of the main crash site. She spoke carefully from memory, as though reciting something she had rehearsed for decades, not as performance, but as precision to make sure she got every word right. One of them was speaking low and fast. The other was listening. I was nobody to them. That's how poor women hear the truth. We're invisible to powerful men in the middle of important conversations. What did they say? Elias asked. She said one of them said, if the child is found, everything changes. The room was very quiet. The other one said, then the child must not be found. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose. I stood in that ditch, Doris said, holding a 3-year-old child I had just found hidden in the thorn bushes, and I listened to those 2 men finish their conversation and get into their vehicle and drive away. And I understood something clearly in that moment. that I have never once in 59 years understood differently. She looked directly at him. Whoever was supposed to find you, she said, must not be the ones to find you first. The silence that followed was the longest of the evening, longer than the silence in the car, longer than the silence in the Westbrook courtyard before Conrad Vane started performing. This was the silence of something fundamental being rearranged. Elias stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the alley, the dark shapes of garbage containers, the orange tinge of the street light on the fence, the ordinary nighttime geography of a life he had built on a foundation he was only now being shown. He said, I grew up with nothing. He said it without accusation. He said it as a fact that deserved to be spoken plainly in the presence of someone who needed to hear it plainly. Yes, Doris said. I said, I worked since I was 14. I watched you cut pills in half because we couldn't afford full doses. I wore borrowed tools through my first 3 years at Kellerman because I didn't have money for my own kit. Yes, she said. He said, and all that time, she said, all that time, you were alive. He turned from the window. She was sitting very straight against her pillows. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were still. She said, you think I don't know the cost of what I chose. She said it quietly. I counted it. Every time you came home from a hard day trying not to let me see what it had cost you. I counted it. Every time I watched you go without something because there wasn't enough, I counted it. But, Elias, he waited. She said, tell me what you would have done if I had told you at 10 years old that you were the missing son of a wealthy man in Detroit. Tell me exactly what you would have done. He opened his mouth. He found nothing. She said you would have gone to them. A 10-year-old boy, you would have gone to people who had already decided you should not be found, and the same men who arranged for you to disappear in 1966 would have arranged for you to disappear again, and this time there would have been no ditch and no thorn bushes and no woman with a borrowed truck. The words landed with the specific force of things that are true and terrible simultaneously. He sat back down in the chair. After a long while, he said, tell me about the man who came. Doris's expression changed slightly. Something moved through it that looked like the return of an old fear, not acute, not sharp, but the deep residual kind that had simply lived in the bones for so long it had become structural. She said, 7 years after I found you. You were 10. He said 1973. She said a man came to the neighborhood asking questions, not asking directly about you never using your name, asking about whether anyone in the area had taken in a child after the I-94 accident years back. He described the badge. Not correctly, the details were slightly wrong, like someone working from a second-hand description, but close enough. Elias's jaw tightened. I told him I didn't know anything about it, Doris said. He looked at me for a long time before he left. The way people look when they're deciding whether you're telling the truth or whether it's worth the effort to make you. What happened then, Elias said. Nothing, she said. For a while, nothing. Then about a year later, I was at the laundromat on Livernois and someone had left a copy of the Free Press. I was waiting for the machine and I was looking through it without really reading, and then I turned a page and I saw him. Him. The man who came asking, she said. He was in a photograph at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a new manufacturing facility somewhere on the east side, standing next to the company's executives. She paused. Standing next to Douglas Harlow. The name sat in the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be said aloud. Elias said it back slowly, as though testing its weight. Douglas Harlow. Thomas's younger brother, Doris said. The one who took over everything after Thomas died. The man who has run the Harlow Industrial Group ever since. Elias was quiet. He was doing the particular kind of thinking that required stillness, the assembling of pieces that had been present separately for a long time without their relationship being visible. He said the men at the crash site. Doris said, I didn't know then. I couldn't have known then. But after I saw that photograph, he said you put it together. She said yes. He said Douglas was there, the night of the accident. He was one of the two men you heard. She said, I believe so. Yes. And the man he sent to find me, Elias said. 7 years later, he wasn't trying to bring me home. Doris said no. He was making sure you hadn't been found. The lamp on the bedside table hummed. The city outside was as quiet as Detroit ever got, which was not very quiet, but quiet enough that the silence inside the apartment had its own presence. He said you were going to die without telling me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I didn't know Eleanor Briggs had found you. I didn't know anyone had found you. I thought perhaps we had outlasted the danger. He said you were going to die without telling me. He said it again, not as accusation and not as repetition, but as the full understanding of a fact that needed to be spoken twice to be completely received. She met his eyes, and he saw in her face finally, in the lines of it, in the particular exhaustion behind her composure, the true cost of what she had carried, not guilt, not shame, the bone-deep tiredness of a woman who had protected something precious for 5 decades, using only the resources of a person whom the world had never given adequate resources. She said, I was afraid, even now, even with you grown and strong and impossible to miss, I was afraid that telling you would move you toward them, and that moving toward them would finish what they started. He breathed. He said, you saved my life. She said, yes. He said, and then you spent 59 years saving it again, one ordinary day at a time. She looked away quickly. Her hands moved over the blanket in the way of people who are managing something that has become suddenly difficult to contain. He stood up from the chair and moved to the side of the bed. He sat on the edge of it, close the way he had sat there 1,000 times over the years when one of them was sick or troubled or simply needed the other to be near. He took her hand. She let him take it. He said, I'm angry. She said, I know. He said, I need you to know that I'm angry. She said, it would worry me more if you weren't. He said, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, you're in it. That doesn't change. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, there is something else. He waited. She said the man who came in 1973. When I saw his photograph in the paper, I was frightened enough that I paid attention for a long time afterward, watching for signs that anyone was still looking. For years after that, nothing. And then she paused. Then what he said. She said, about 15 years ago, I was at the pharmacy on Dexter. The man behind me in line was on his phone, having a conversation. He didn't bother to lower his voice for the way people do when they've decided the people around them don't matter enough to notice. He was talking about a property sale, a building on the east side. The sale had gone through a company with a name I didn't recognize. But then he said another name, the parent company. What name? Elias said. She said Harlow Meridian Holdings. He went still. She said I looked it up afterward. Harlow Meridian Holdings was a subsidiary. The parent company was Harlow Industrial Group, and the managing director of Harlow Meridian Holdings was listed as a senior associate of Douglas Harlow's legal team. She looked at him. They're still active, she said. The company, the family, the money, all of it is still there, and Douglas Harlow is still in the middle of it. Elias sat on the edge of his mother's bed and held her hand and let the full weight of what he now knew settle through him. Thomas Harlow had built something, had intended it for his son, had died not knowing his son was alive, was living 40 minutes away in a small apartment with a woman who had found him in a ditch and loved him into a man. Douglas Harlow had taken that inheritance, had been running it for 47 years, had sent a man to make sure in 1973 that the lost child stayed lost. And 3 weeks ago, Eleanor Briggs had said it. In the car had shown him the evidence on her tablet, while he was absorbing everything else 3 weeks ago in a private club. The son of the man who had stood beside Douglas Harlow on that service road in 1966 had said in a recorded conversation with Douglas Harlow, Make sure bloodline alone isn't enough. Elias turned the phrase over carefully in his mind, the way he turned over a mechanical problem, examining it from each angle, identifying the stress points, understanding where the failure was designed to occur. Make sure bloodline alone isn't enough. That was not a statement made about an abstraction. That was a statement made by men who knew something was coming and were discussing how to prevent it from mattering. He squeezed Doris's hand once. She squeezed back. He stood up. He said, "I'm going to need you somewhere safe before the next step." She said, "Eleanor Briggs already called. This afternoon before the reunion." He looked at her. She said she told me what she was going to tell you. She asked whether I would allow it. I told her that was not her question to ask me. It was yours. He breathed. She said, "There's a facility, private, on the north side. She has arrangements." He said, "Are you willing?" She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had been watching him clearly for 59 years. She said, "I've been waiting for you to be ready. Not me, you." He picked up the photograph from the bedside table, looked at it one more time. The man with the rolled sleeves, the hand on the small boy's shoulder, the workshop behind them. He put the photograph in his jacket pocket, beside the half badge in its flannel cloth. He bent and pressed his forehead briefly against Doris's, the way he had done since he was small, the way that had never needed a name or a reason. Then he straightened. Whatever Douglas Harlow had built in 59 years of uncontested control, he had built on the assumption that the person he had erased would stay erased. He had built it on the bedrock of someone else's silence and someone else's fear, and the durable institutional tendency of the powerful to believe that the people they stepped over would remain on the ground. That assumption had about 48 hours left in it. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. He said, "Get some rest." Doris said, "Don't tell me what to do in my own bedroom." He almost smiled, walked out, let the door close softly behind him. In the dark of the hallway, he stood for a moment with his hand resting on the wall, the same wall he had touched 10,000 mornings leaving for a shift, the same apartment that had been his whole world and was now suddenly a starting point rather than a boundary. I thought about what Eleanor Briggs had said at the end of their conversation in the car. "They've already moved Mr. Ward. They've been moving since someone in my network made an inquiry 6 weeks ago that was less discreet than it should have been. They know something is in motion. They don't know it's you, not yet." I thought about the specific kind of danger that came not from men who were panicking, but from men who were preparing, controlled men, men with lawyers and boards and decades of practice at making inconvenient things disappear through procedure rather than violence. He stood in the dark hallway of the apartment he had lived in for 40 years and understood with the complete clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime diagnosing systems exactly what kind of failure was coming for Douglas Harlow and everyone who had built their future on the certainty that Elias Ward would stay buried. He went to the kitchen, poured the last of the coffee into a cup, stood at the window, and looked out at the alley. He had a call to make. There is a specific kind of morning that follows a night when everything changes. It does not announce itself differently than any other morning. The light comes the same way. The city makes the same sounds. Coffee still requires water and heat and the ordinary patience of waiting. But the man standing in the kitchen knows that the world he is moving through is not the same world he moved through yesterday, and that knowledge sits in the body differently than thought. It sits in the shoulders, in the steadiness of the hands, in the particular quality of attention a person brings to small actions when larger ones are coming. Elias Ward stood at his kitchen window at 5:15 in the morning and drank his coffee and watched the alley come into gray light and understood that he had perhaps 48 hours before the thing that had been buried for 59 years either came fully into the open or was buried again, this time deliberately by men with resources. He was only beginning to understand the extent of. Adi had made the call to Eleanor Briggs at 11:30 the night before. She had answered on the second ring, which told him she had been waiting. He told her two things. First, Doris needed to be moved before morning to the facility she had described under a different name with security he could verify. Second, whatever next steps existed, he would understand them completely before agreeing to any of them. Not briefed, not summarized, completely. She had said, I expected both of those conditions. Then she had said, there's a third thing you should know. The DNA confirmation process I've initiated, independent laboratory, full chain of custody, documentation, will return results within 36 hours. When it does, we will have approximately one window to move before Douglas Harlow's legal team files preemptive actions to contest the methodology. He had said, how long is the window? She had said, if we move correctly long enough. I had said, that's not a number. She had said 6 hours, perhaps 8. He had said, then we use them all. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, placed it upside down in the drying rack with the careful precision of a man who understood that small orders mattered when large ones were in motion. He went to check on Doris. She was already awake, already dressed, sitting on the edge of her bed with her small travel bag packed and her coat folded over her arm, and her expression carrying the composed determination of a woman who had made her decision in the night and was not interested in revisiting it. She said, stop looking at me like I might change my mind. He said, I wasn't. She said, you were. You do that thing with your jaw. He said, I'll get my jacket. The car Eleanor had arranged arrived at 6. A plain sedan, not the luxury vehicle from the night before, deliberately ordinary, the kind of car that moved through neighborhoods without generating comment. The driver was a woman quiet and professional who confirmed the destination with Elias directly before Doris got in. Standing on the sidewalk outside the apartment building in the early morning dark, Elias held Doris's hand for a moment before she got into the car. She let him. Then she straightened and looked at him with the specific expression she had been giving him since he was a boy, the one that communicated simultaneously that she believed in him completely and would not tolerate any unnecessary drama about it. She said, go do what needs doing. He said, I'll be there tonight. She said, I know. She got in the car. Then before the door closed, she turned back and said, Elias. He looked at her. She said, you've been the right person for this your entire life. You just didn't have the full picture yet. The door closed. The car moved. He stood on the sidewalk and watched it go, and then stood there for another 30 seconds in the cold morning air, letting the silence work. Then he went back inside to get his jacket and his phone and the flannel-wrapped half-badge and the photograph. He took all of it with him, because the day was beginning. Eleanor Briggs met him at a law office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Detroit, the kind of building that had been renovated twice in the past decade and now housed the sort of firms that dealt in the architecture of serious money. She was already there when he arrived, seated at a conference table with 2 other people Elias didn't know, and a spread of documents that had the organized density of preparation rather than presentation. Beside her sat Theo Collard. Elias recognized the name from what Eleanor had told him the night before. 45, a corporate attorney who had spent years doing work adjacent to the Harlow family's legal structure, not directly employed by them, but operating in the same professional ecosystem, handling transactions that passed through their network. He was lean, careful in his movements, with the look of a man who had been running a private calculation for some time and had recently arrived at an answer he wasn't comfortable with. He stood when Elias entered, extended his hand. His grip was firm in the way of men trying to communicate reliability. Elias shook it and looked at him directly. He said, Eleanor told me you've been sitting on information. Callard said yes. He said, why now? Callard held his gaze. Sad because sitting on it stopped feeling like neutrality and started feeling like a choice, and I didn't want to have made that choice by default. Elias looked at him for another moment. Then he sat down. They worked for 4 hours. Eleanor laid it out piece by piece, and Elias listened the way he had always listened to complex systems, fully, without interruption, holding each element in relation to the others, building the complete picture before asking questions. He did not let the scale of it move him away from precision. The larger the machine, the more important it was to understand each component's function before trying to diagnose the failure. What the documents showed was this. In November 1966, the accident on I-94 had not been a random collision. The commercial truck involved had been leased through a company that dissolved 14 months later. Its principals never publicly identified its records, archived in a storage facility that experienced a partial fire in 1969. Douglas Harlow had been on I-94 that night, not as a witness, not as a concerned family member. He had been in a vehicle parked on the service road east of the crash site. Security footage from a highway maintenance depot 300 yards away, footage that had survived because it was on a state system and not accessible to private parties without legal process, showed a black SUV in that position for 41 minutes after the accident. The vehicle's registration, traced through records Collard had accessed through a compliance review tied to an unrelated property matter, came back to a holding company that connected through 2 intermediate steps to Douglas Harlow personally. The man Doris had seen in the neighborhood in 1973, the one who had come asking about a child after the accident, was identified in Eleanor's investigation as a former private investigator named Roy Stassen, who had been employed on a contract basis by a security consulting firm retained by Douglas Harlow's personal legal team from 1968 through 1979. Stassen had died in 2004. His files had passed to his son, who had kept them without understanding their significance and who had responded to Theo Callard's carefully framed inquiry with the confused cooperation of a man releasing information he didn't know was valuable. Victor Vane, Conrad's father, appeared in the records 3 times, once in the photograph from the I-94 service road, standing beside Douglas Harlow's vehicle in the rain, once in a contract from 1968 when his small construction company received its first significant commercial project, a Harlow subsidiary facility on the east side of Detroit, and once in Stassen's files named as a secondary contact for certain communications that Stassen had described in his own private notation as sensitive cleanup matters. Elias read that phrase and felt something move through him that was not anger in the ordinary sense. It was colder than anger and more precise, the rage that comes when you see in plain language that your disappearance had been administrative, that the ending of a child's life, or what was intended to be the ending, had been described in the internal communications of powerful men as a matter of cleanup. I thought about his mother, the household staff member who had died at the scene. He did not know her name yet. He would need to know her name. That was a task for when there was space for it, but he would not forget that it was a task, and he would not let the business of the day crowd it permanently aside. He sat with that for a moment. Then he moved on to the next document. The audio recording was the piece that changed the temperature of the room most noticeably when Eleanor played it. It had been obtained through a compliance review that Collard had initiated 3 weeks earlier, a review of a private dining club's security systems that was technically within the scope of a financial audit he was conducting for an unrelated client. The recording was partially degraded in sections and had been captured from a system that was not intended to preserve conversations, but it was enough. A male voice confirmed, through comparison with public speech recordings, as Douglas Harlow said, "She's moving faster than I expected. That needs to stop." A second male voice said, "We don't know yet what she actually has." Douglas again, it doesn't matter what she has. What matters is what a jury would do with it if it reached a public forum. Handle the framing before it becomes a story. Then a third voice, younger, Conrad Vane. He said, what about Ward himself? A pause. Douglas said Ward is a 62-year-old mechanic in Detroit who has spent his entire life not knowing what he is. The challenge isn't him. The challenge is the woman helping him. Discredit the process and the man has nothing, Conrad said, and if the DNA confirms it. Douglas said, make sure bloodline alone isn't enough. Eleanor stopped the recording. The room was quiet for a moment. Elias looked at the table. He thought about Conrad Vane at the Westbrook reunion the previous night, handing him a drink that was meant to contain a suggestion about his place in the room. He thought about Victor Vane's name in the 1966 record standing in the rain beside a black SUV, while somewhere in the thorn bushes, a 3-year-old child breathed carefully and tried not to be found. 2 generations. The Vane family had been useful to the Harlow family across 2 generations, and in exchange had received their escalating comfort from a construction contract in 1968 to Conrad's current position as a corporate CEO with a seat on 3 boards and a name that opened rooms. He said to Eleanor, what's the plan for tonight? She said, the Harlow Foundation Annual Gala, Grand Ballroom at the Meridian Hotel. Douglas will deliver the legacy address at 9 o'clock. The full board will be present. 17 of the 22 board members have historical loyalty to Thomas Harlow rather than Douglas. They went along with Douglas because there was no alternative. 3 of them have been quietly concerned about governance irregularities for the past 2 years and have said so in communications that Callard has access to through the compliance review. Elias said, and the DNA. Eleanor said, confirmed this morning. Chain of custody, intact independent laboratory, results sealed and ready. Probability of biological relation between you and the late Thomas Harlow is 99.9998%. He sat with that number for a moment. Not what it meant financially, not yet. That was a calculation for another time. What it meant simply plainly, in the language of a man who had lived 62 years without knowing the full shape of his own beginning. He said, I need to see Howard Gaines before tonight. Eleanor looked at him. He said he's in the hospital. Rolla Westcott sent me a message this morning. The exertion from last night set something off. Nothing critical, but he's there, and I want to see him before anything else happens. Eleanor nodded. She said we have time. The gala doesn't begin until 7. He found Howard Gaines in a room on the 3rd floor of Detroit Receiving Hospital, propped against pillows, glasses on his nose, irritated about the television remote and the quality of the lunch he had been served, and the general institutional tendency to treat a man as though he had already stopped being interesting. When Elias came through the door, Gaines looked up and said, You better not be here to apologize for anything. Elias said, I'm not. Good, Gaines said. Sit down. You have that look you used to get when you were working through a problem in your head and hadn't finished yet. Elias sat. He did not explain everything. There was not time, and Gaines did not need every detail to understand the essential shape of what was happening. Elias told him enough. The badge, the car, Eleanor Briggs, the accident in 1966, his mother, the full weight of what was coming tonight. Gaines listened in the way he had always listened, with complete attention, without interruption, without performing reaction. When Elias finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I always knew there was something too precise about the way you were treated. Targeted cruelty has a different quality than casual cruelty. Casual cruelty is sloppy. What you experienced was never sloppy. Elias looked at him. Gaines said, not that it made it more bearable. I'm only saying I recognize the shape of it. He adjusted his glasses, looked at Elias steadily. He said, what you're doing tonight, you understand. It's not just about you. Elias said, I know. Gaines said men like Douglas Harlow depend on the assumption that people without institutional power will either not discover the truth, or if they discover it, will not have the standing to act on it. Every time that assumption is proved wrong, it becomes slightly less reliable as a foundation for future crimes. Elias said, "I understand." Gaines said, "I'm not asking you to carry that as a burden. I'm asking you to carry it as a reason. There's a difference." Elias sat with that. Then he said, "You told me once that humiliation was not evidence of inferiority." Gaines said, "I remember." Elias said, "I've been carrying that for 45 years. Gaines said, "Good. It was meant to last." They sat in companionable quiet for a moment. Hospital sounds moved in the hallway outside. The television in the corner showed news with the sound off. Then Gaines said, "Go do it, Elias. Do it cleanly. Don't give them anything to work with on the other side." Elias stood. He shook the old man's hand firm, warm, the grip of a teacher, and the grip of a student, and the grip of two men who had always understood each other without requiring much ceremony. He said, "I'll come back tomorrow." Gaines said, "I'll be here. I have a disagreement with this hospital's coffee policy that is far from resolved." Elias walked out into the hospital corridor and took the elevator down and walked out into the cold afternoon air of Detroit and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the city around him, and understood with the complete clarity of a man who has been moving towards something for a long time that the moving was almost done. The Meridian Hotel ballroom was everything the architects of institutional power understood how to build. Crystal chandeliers descended from a ceiling that was 20 feet high and covered in a geometric pattern of gilded plasterwork. Round tables spread across the floor in perfect symmetry, each one covered in white linen and set with the kind of glassware that communicated a specific relationship between the people at those tables and the question of cost. A string quartet played near the stage, Mozart steady and elegant, the musical equivalent of a firm handshake. On the walls, large screens displayed a rotating series of images, construction projects, hospital wings, scholarship recipients, the smiling evidence of a foundation that had decided to make its self-regard publicly available as virtue. At the tables sat the architecture of established power, board members and their spouses, state legislators and their donors, corporate partners and their expectations, the men and women who made things happen in Detroit and Michigan, and in several cases considerably further than that, people for whom this event was both a social obligation and a professional calculation. They ate and drank and moved through each other's proximity with the practiced ease of people who had been sharing these rooms for decades and knew exactly what each room required of them. Douglas Harlow moved through it all with the fluency of a man at the center of his own institution. He was 70 years old, lean and straight, with the silver hair of a man who had long since passed the point where appearance required effort. He greeted people with the specific warmth of someone who had trained himself to make every person he spoke to feel for the duration of that conversation like the most important person in the room. I had been doing it for 5 decades and had gotten very good at it. Elias watched him from the side entrance for a few minutes before moving inside. He watched Douglas Harlow work the room and understood, watching him, why the man had lasted as long as he had. It was not simply money. Money alone did not produce that particular quality of social authority. It was the combination of money and performance, the ability to make every room believe that the person at its center was there by natural right rather than constructed advantage. Elias had spent his life being assessed by rooms. He understood how they worked. He also understood that rooms, once their framework shifted, could change completely in under a minute. Theo Collard was already inside, positioned near the east wall, with his phone in his jacket pocket, and the look of a man who had committed to a course of action and was managing the physical reality of that commitment. Eleanor was at the control panel near the stage entrance, speaking quietly, with a young man who handled the event's audio visual systems. She had prepared him with the materials 3 hours earlier, under the explanation of a planned tribute presentation that would be added to the evening's program. It was not entirely untrue. At 5 minutes to 9, Douglas Harlow moved toward the stage with the unhurried pace of a man approaching something he owned. At 4 minutes to 9, Conrad Vane entered the ballroom from the main entrance. He was with a group of 3 others, business associates from their manner, and he moved toward a table near the front with the confidence of someone who had reserved exactly the right position. He did not see Elias in the side alcove. Elias watched him sit down and settle in with the ease of a man who believed the evening had been scripted in advance. At 3 minutes to 9, the string quartet concluded its piece, and the room began its gradual realignment toward the stage. At 2 minutes to 9, Douglas reached the podium. The applause was immediate and substantial, the applause of people who understood that their presence in this room was connected to their relationship with the man at the front of it, and who expressed that understanding through sound. Douglas let it run for a moment. Then he raised one hand, a practiced gesture, neither demanding silence nor begging for it, simply indicating readiness, and the room settled. He began. He spoke of Thomas Harlow, the way men speak of people they have spent decades replacing, with the specific warmth of performed grief, the careful tenderness of someone who understood that the dead could not contradict a narrative built in their name. He spoke of vision and sacrifice, and the particular responsibility of stewardship, of carrying forward what the dead could no longer protect. He was good at it. The room received it with the nodding attention of people hearing something that confirmed what they had come prepared to believe. Elias listened from the side alcove and felt nothing complicated about what he was hearing. It was a performance. He had seen performances before. The only question that mattered about a performance was what happened when the lights changed. Douglas reached the section of his remarks about continuity, about the responsibility of the present to protect the architecture of the future. He used the word legacy 4 times in 2 minutes, which was information about what the word was being asked to carry. He said, and it is in that spirit, the spirit of protecting what was built with vision and sacrifice, that we move forward together. Into Eleanor's voice came quietly through Elias's earpiece now. Elias straightened his jacket. He was wearing the same clothes as the night before, the dark trousers, the white shirt, the 12-year jacket. He had not changed them because he had not gone home to change them, and also because he saw no reason to. He was not performing wealth. He was not performing anything. He walked out of the alcove and through the side door and into the ballroom. The room changed in the way rooms change when something enters that the framework hasn't prepared for, not loudly, like a current changing direction. First the people closest to the entrance, then the ripple spreading outward toward the center. Heads turned, then more heads. The particular silence of recognition, people placing a face they had last seen on a news blog that morning, people connecting the man walking through the ballroom with the headline they had read over breakfast, people beginning to understand that the evening was not going to end where they had expected. Elias walked toward the stage at his own pace. Douglas saw him when he was perhaps 40 feet from the front of the room. The performance did not stop immediately. Good performers don't break on the first unexpected element, but something in it shifted, a microscopic recalibration, the eyes going careful in a way the face was trying to prevent. He said, "I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. It appears we have an unscheduled." Elias said, "There's been a misunderstanding." He said it clearly, at a volume that reached the room without effort. He was 62 years old and had been talking to machinery in loud environments for 4 decades. He knew how to make a voice carry. For 59 years, the room went very quiet. He reached the stage steps and went up them without asking permission. Douglas said, "I don't know what you've been told, but this is not." The screen behind him changed. The Harlow Foundation, imagery, The scholarship recipients, the hospital wings disappeared. In its place, a photograph filled the screen. I-94, November 1966. Rain and wrecked vehicles and emergency lights. And on the service road parked at a careful distance from the official activity, a black SUV. Beside it, two men visible in the grainy resolution of a highway depot camera that had been running for 41 minutes without anyone thinking to check it. Douglas Harlow and Victor Vane, not searching, not grieving, watching. The room made a sound, not quite a gasp, the sound of a collective understanding arriving at multiple people simultaneously. Douglas turned and looked at the image. For the first time in the evening, his face did something unplanned. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but in a room full of people who understood the language of power and its disruptions, 2 seconds was more than enough. He recovered. He said, "This is manufactured. This is taken completely out of context by people with a specific financial agenda." The second screen lit up. The chain of payments, the shell companies, the dissolved corporations, the retainer records for Roy Stassen, the private investigator dated 1973, listing among his activities an inquiry into the whereabouts of a child in southwest Detroit. Conrad Vane, at his table near the front, was no longer sitting with the ease he had arrived with. He was very still. His hands were flat on the table. He was looking at the screen the way people look at things they had believed were safely buried. The third screen, the audio-visual system, played the recording from the private dining club. Douglas's voice clear enough to reach the room. "Make sure bloodline alone isn't enough." Then Conrad's voice, "What about Ward himself?" And Douglas Ward is a 62-year-old mechanic in Detroit who has spent his entire life not knowing what he is. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes significant things. Not comfortable silence, not the silence of people at rest, the silence of a room recalculating. A woman at a table in the second row, one of the board members, Eleanor, had identified as having historical loyalty to Thomas Harlow, said to no one specifically, and everyone generally, "My God." Douglas turned from the screens to Elias. His composure was still present, but it had the quality now of a structure that had lost a foundational support, still standing but visibly different. He said, "You have been coached into a fantasy by people who want access to this family's assets. Whatever she has told you." Elias said, "She told me that the man I've been for 62 years has a name you buried." He said it at the same volume as everything else, clean and even and without performance. He let the room receive it. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the flannel cloth and unwrapped it on the surface of the podium. The half badge lay in the light, heavy, worn, smooth at the edges, the partial engraving still visible on its face. He said, "Thomas Harlow kept the other half." He looked at Douglas. He said, "I know because Eleanor Briggs found it in the estate records, logged in the personal effects inventory Thomas filed after the accident. The other half of this badge stored in a private document box listed as object belonging to my son." The room was completely still. Douglas said, "This proves nothing." The fourth screen lit. The DNA confirmation document, chain of custody verified, independent laboratory certification. The number in clear type at the bottom of the page, 99.9998%. A board member at the far left table stood up. He was in his early 70s, with the bearing of a man who had sat on this board since before Douglas's tenure began. He said, "Douglas." His voice was controlled, but the control was carrying something heavy. He said, "I want you to stand at that podium and tell me in front of this room and these people that you did not know this man existed." Douglas said nothing. The board member said, "I want you to tell me that the resources of this foundation, resources built by a man who died believing his son was gone, were not used for 59 years to ensure that son stayed gone." Douglas said, "This is not the appropriate venue for." The board member said, "This is the only venue. You made it this venue the moment you built your entire claim to this institution on the grief of a man you were responsible to. He turned to the room. He said to the other board members specifically, I am calling an emergency governance session tonight before anyone leaves this building. 2 other board members stood immediately, then a third, then a fourth. Douglas looked at the room. He looked at the screens. He looked at Elias. And, for the second time in the evening, something moved in his face that the performance could not contain. But this time, it was not recalibration. It was the specific expression of a man understanding for the first time that the architecture he had lived inside for 59 years had just become a structure without a foundation. I took one step back from the podium, then another. The movement was small and involuntary, the physical reflex of a man whose legs had understood what his face was still processing. 2 security personnel who had spent the evening positioned near the stage exits moved differently now, not toward Elias, toward Douglas. One of them spoke quietly into an earpiece. A board member near the center aisle stood and said in a voice that carried to the edges of the room, no one leaves until the governance session is convened. Conrad Vane sat at his table, with his hands still flat on the white linen and his eyes focused on nothing. He did not attempt to rise. He did not attempt to speak. The composure that had served him elegantly for 40 years had become, in the span of 4 minutes, the only thing he had left, and he was holding it the way a man holds the last wall of a house that the rest of the building has already abandoned. Elias stood at the podium and let the room do what it was doing. He did not speak again. There was nothing more that needed to be said by him. The evidence was present. The board was moving. The room had shifted completely past the point where Douglas Harlow's version of events could reassert itself as the natural order. He picked up the half badge and wrapped it back in the flannel and put it in his pocket. Then he walked down the stage steps. He found a quiet room off the main corridor, a small meeting room, unused with a window looking out at the city. He sat down. He put his hands on the table and let the physical fact of the evening settle through him. I thought about Doris in the facility, on the north side, in a bed that was too wide with a pillow that smelled like someone else's idea of clean. He thought about Howard Gaines arguing with the nursing staff about coffee. He thought about the apartment with the bubbled linoleum and the pill bottles on the counter and the wooden box under the bed. I thought about Thomas Harlow, who had died in 1978, believing his son was gone, who had never known that a woman with a borrowed truck had found that son in a ditch and made a choice that cost her everything she had, which was not much, and given him everything that mattered, which was more than he had ever been able to calculate. I thought about his mother. He still did not know her name. He would find it. That was a promise he made quietly to himself in the small meeting room, while the sounds of an institution being forced to reckon with its own foundation moved through the wall from the corridor beyond. He was still sitting there when the door opened. Selden Harlow came in, Douglas's son, 35 years old, precisely dressed, the evident product of private schools and curated opportunity. He closed the door behind him and stood for a moment without speaking, which told Elias that whatever he had come to say had required some preparation. Then he said, I grew up in that house. Elias looked at him. Selden said, I grew up hearing my father talk about his brother, about Thomas, about the great man he had the burden of succeeding, the grief he carried. He said it was the defining tragedy of his life losing his brother's son, not being able to bring him home. He stopped, started again. I said, I don't know how much he told me was deliberate and how much was the particular self-deception of men who have convinced themselves of a story they invented. I don't know which parts of him believed what he said and which parts knew what he had done. Elias said, does it matter? Selden said, I think it matters to me. He said it without defensiveness, just plainly. Elias said, why are you here? Selden was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I needed to look at you directly, and say that I am not my father's decision. He looked at Elias with the particular intensity of a young man trying to make a precise point, while also understanding that precise points don't fully cover what needs to be covered. He said, I can't undo what was done. I don't have the power to undo it, and I'm not arrogant enough to pretend that saying the right things in this room makes it right. But I grew up in a house built on what was done to you, and I didn't know it, and I needed you to know that I didn't know. Elias looked at him for a long time. He looked at the face of a man who was 35 years old and was in the process in a single evening of having to dismantle the entire history of the house he had grown up in and understand what the foundation actually was. He said, I hear you. Selden said, that's all I'm asking. Elias nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who is not forgiving a legacy but is acknowledging a person. Selden said, whatever you decide to do with the company, with the board, with the legal process, I won't stand in it. I won't support my father's defense. That's as much as I can promise you right now. He turned to go, then stopped. I said, there's something else. He reached into his jacket and removed an envelope. He set it on the table in front of Elias. He said, my grandfather Thomas had a private document collection. It was kept in a personal archive that was separate from the company's official records. My father had access to it, but he never used it. I found it 6 months ago when I was reviewing estate assets. I didn't understand what I was looking at then. I think I understand now. He left without saying anything more. Elias sat with the envelope for a moment. Then he opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, handwritten, dated March 1977, 1 year before Thomas Harlow died. The handwriting was the careful script of a man who wrote infrequently but took it seriously when he did. It read, I believe my son is alive. I cannot prove it. Every investigator I have employed has returned with nothing, but nothing is not the same as proof of absence. My brother believes I am making myself ill with hope that should have been surrendered years ago. Perhaps he is right, but I know my son, and I believe something in the world is carrying him forward. If anyone finds this document after I am gone, if anyone ever finds the boy, know that everything I built was built for him, not for legacy, not for the name, for the boy. If he is alive, it belongs to him. Elias folded the paper carefully along its original creases. He held it in both hands for a long moment. He thought about a man sitting at a desk in 1977, writing those words by hand, choosing each one carefully, believing in something he could not prove. He thought about what it cost to go on believing for 12 years in the absence of evidence. He thought about what kind of man did that. Then he put the letter in his jacket pocket, next to the flannel-wrapped badge, next to the photograph of a man in a workshop with his hand on a small boy's shoulder. He took out his phone and called Doris. She answered on the third ring. He said, Are you all right? She said, I'm in a hospital bed that's too wide, and the pillow smells like someone else's idea of clean. I'm fine. He said it went the way it needed to go. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. It was always going to go that way if you were in the room. You just needed the room. He said, I'll be there in an hour. She said, I'll be awake. I can't sleep in a pillow that smells like this. He said, Doris. She said, yes. He said, I found a letter. Thomas Harlow wrote it in 1977, a year before he died. He said he believed his son was alive. He said everything he built was built for the boy, not for the name, for the boy. The line was quiet for several seconds. Then Doris said very quietly, good. He was right to believe it. He said, I'm going to find out her name. A pause. She said, whose name? He said, my mother's. The woman who died in the accident. I don't know her name yet, but I'm going to find it. The line was very quiet. Then Doris said, yes, find it. He sat for another moment after the call ended. The sounds of the gala transformed now from celebration into the urgent procedural noise of an institution in emergency session reached him faintly through the wall. He let it be background, Let it be what it was, the sound of something working itself out in the way that things worked out, which was never clean and never simple and took longer than anyone wanted. He thought about what came next. Not the board proceedings, not the legal process, which would be long and difficult and would not be won in a single evening. Douglas Harlow had resources and a practiced legal team and the institutional inertia of 59 years on his side. Good mechanics did not expect every repair to be fast. They expected it to be thorough. I thought about the foundation he had told Doris he would build. Scholarships for children from the neighborhoods that built the workforce this city had run on for a century and never adequately returned to. Medical support for the caregivers, the women and men like Doris Ward, who raised children who needed raising with no institutional support and no recognition and no compensation except the children themselves. Legal aid for the people who found out too late that the system had documents with their names on them that they had never seen, decisions made about their futures that they had never been consulted on. And one more thing, a research fund, small at first perhaps, but specifically dedicated to identifying the unnamed, the household workers and drivers and ordinary people who had died in the service of wealthy families and whose names had been absorbed into incident reports and estate documents without ceremony or memory, people whose lives had been reduced in the records of powerful men to the category of staff loss. His mother deserved better than that. So did everyone like her. I thought about the name he had told Doris the foundation would carry. Doris Ward had been nobody to the world that had built the Harlow fortune. She had been a woman in Detroit in 1966 driving a borrowed truck to pick through accident debris because there was nothing else available. The world that had arranged the events of that November night had made her exactly the kind of invisible person that powerful men relied on. Her invisibility was structural. It was necessary for the machine. And she had used that invisibility to save a life, had spent 59 years maintaining the cover that invisibility provided, had paid for it with poverty and secrecy and the long private grief of a woman who loved someone she could not fully protect, because fully protecting him would have required telling him a truth that might have gotten him killed. He was going to put her name on something that lasted. He stood up. I walked out of the meeting room and down the corridor and through the lobby of the Meridian Hotel and out into the night air of Detroit. The city was doing what it always did, making its sounds, moving its traffic, existing in the complicated and continuing present tense of a place that had been broken and rebuilt so many times that the rebuilding had become as characteristic as the breaking. The lights were on. The streets were occupied. Somewhere across town, in a room that smelled like someone else's idea of clean, a fierce and stubborn woman was awake and waiting. He walked to the car. I got in. The driver pulled into traffic. Detroit moved past the windows in long streaks of light and shadow. In his jacket pocket, 3 things rested against his ribs. The flannel cloth with the half badge worn smooth by 59 years of being held. The photograph of a man in a workshop with his hand on a small boy's shoulder, and a letter from a dead man who had written in careful script in the last year of his life, I believe something in the world is carrying him forward. Something had been. It had been a woman with a borrowed truck and a fierce, stubborn heart and the particular courage of people who have nothing except their own judgment and are forced to trust it completely in the moments when everything depends on it. It had been a teacher with worn cardigans and patient eyes who put harder problems on the desk of a boy who needed to be seen. It had been 40 years of early mornings and honest work and the slow grinding accumulation of a self that belonged to no one but the man who had built it. The first time a luxury car stopped in front of Elias Ward, the people watching thought the shock was the story. They recorded it on their phones and they talked about it afterward, and they framed it the way people frame things that are easier to understand as spectacle than as meaning. They were wrong about what it was. The story was not the moment the car stopped. The story was everything that had made the man standing in front of it. It was the box under the bed, and the pill bottles on the counter, and the palm pressed flat against a closed door in the dark. It was a ditch on I-94 on a November night in 1966, and a woman who heard something breathing in the thorn bushes and made a choice that cost her everything she could not afford. It was a classroom and a harder problem placed on a desk without comment. It was 4 decades of work done well, because work done well was its own argument against the world's opinion of who you were. It was a man who had been told in 1,000 different ways over 62 years that the room was not designed for him, and who had shown up every day anyway and fixed what was broken and gone home and come back. Not rescue, not revelation, not the sudden arrival of what had always been deserved. Just a man, complete, undiminished, the same man he had always been, now standing in the full light of what that had always been worth. He looked out the window at the city he had grown up in and worked in and stayed in when there was no particular reason to stay, except that staying was what you did when a place was yours. Detroit moved past in the dark. He was going to see Doris. He was going to find his mother's name. He was going to do the work. That was enough. It had always been enough. The only difference now was that the world was going to have to reckon with it.